Hi everyone, welcome to Reason with Science. I'm your host, Jitendra. This conversation is with Alex Bezzerides, who is a professor of biology at Lewis Clark State College in Idaho. He has written an amazing book, Evolution Gone Wrong. Do check out his book and his work. In this conversation, we talk about evolution, evolution by natural selection, evolution of aches and pains in human species. We also talk about why it is so difficult to give birth in humans, why human children are so helpless. We also compare evolution with intelligent design and also the future of human evolution. So I hope you enjoy the conversation. Thank you for listening. Okay, hi Alex. So welcome to today's discussion on the topic not so intelligent design of evolution.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here and talk about it.
Yeah. So you are a professor of biology. That's your affiliation, and you wrote a book, Evolution Gone Wrong, on anatomy and of course on evolution. So what are your interests? Like, do you teach biology, or what else you are doing in your research and career?
Sure. So yeah, I'm a pretty broadly trained biologist. I teach at a small school. It only has 2,000 or 3,000 students, and so the classes, my biggest classes might have 40 students, and a lot of my classes have 8 or 10 students. And because I'm at sort of a small school, you have to teach a wide variety of classes. So even this semester, for instance, I'm teaching an intro bio class with all freshmen. They're biology majors. But then and with all its labs, and then in the same semester, I'm teaching an upper division class in entomology, an insect class. And then next semester, I pivot to all pre-nursing classes. Next semester, I'm only teaching the second semester of anatomy and physiology, which will be a completely different, you're training people to go into professional programs, and it's much more applied practical skills. We'll be drawing blood and looking at listening to heart sounds and things like that in lab, rather than this week we're identifying beetles in my in my entomology class. So I get pulled in a lot of directions with my teaching, and I don't have a ton of time for research, but when I do research, I'm a chemical ecologist by training. I study the compounds insects use for defensive purposes and reproductive purposes, and I did that for a number of years and published a few papers in peer-reviewed journals, and then I decided at some point, I taught anatomy and physiology for a long time, and I'd also been sort of trained as an evolutionary biologist, and I wanted to do some broader thinking. I was really inspired by the writing of people like Jared Diamond or E.O. Wilson, people that had these careers as scientists that were very focused and very much down a rabbit hole of one small esoteric topic, but then they backed out and wrote these incredible books that gave more of a representation of science to the broad public. And I wanted to try, I wanted to take a crack at that and take a broader subject that I could write about. So I found this subject that I thought was really interesting, sort of looking at the aches and pains of the body and how they came to be, how they evolved. And it sort of married my interest in anatomy with my interest in evolution. And the book was kind of born of that.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And from your writing, it's easy to understand that you have that kind of experience in different fields of biology.
Right.
But then, what prompted you to write Evolution Gone Wrong?
So it's several years ago. It took me several years because with as much as I teach, I can only kind of write one day a week. I set aside Thursday, which is today. I set aside Thursday to work on writing and research and those kinds of projects. I don't make it Friday because I'm always afraid if I make it Friday that I'll kind of blow it off, So I make Thursday the day I don't have any classes, and that's my day to do these kinds of things. And a few years ago, I was in class. We were talking about the digestive system, and I was showing a picture of the mouth and the teeth fitting in the mouth. And I kind of looked at the picture, and it's in the first chapter of the book. I show a picture of the mouth, and it's just like this perfect textbook image of the mouth. And I kind of paused, and I just did a quick informal poll of the class. And I just, there was a pretty big class. There might've been, 50 students in there. And I just asked him, so, how many of you have a mouth that looks like this? I said, everybody raise your hands. And okay, how many people had braces? And all right, lower your hand if you had braces. And all right, that takes out half the class. And then same thing, wisdom teeth pulled. And then by the time you get through braces and wisdom teeth, you're down to like 3 people in the entire class that actually have all their teeth in their mouth, and maybe only one of those has them, and they fit relatively well and they're straight. And I thought, well, this is pretty fascinating. Like, we teach this sort of, oh, the teeth fit perfectly in the jaw, but in reality, most people's teeth do not fit in their jaw well at all. And I didn't know why. Like, at the time, I had never read about why that was the case. And so I started to read about it, and I got into all these different avenues of research, and it brought in all these cultural angles, like when humans started using cutlery and tools, and when they started to control fire and pottery and all these things that got outside of anatomy that I thought was really wild and interesting. And it turns out the answer was really complex and also really fascinating. And that, I found that so interesting, and I brought a lot of that back to the classroom. But then I started to look at other places in the body through that same lens. Like, why don't our eyes work quite as well as they should? Why do we choke so often? And I realized, well, that kind of logic can be applied all throughout the body. And then I started to outline an idea for a book. I wrote a couple sample chapters, and that worked like 2 years into the process now. It took me a couple of years to kind of get an outline, get a couple sample chapters written, and then I was ready to sort of head down and see if I could turn it into a real thing.
Right. And I think it really paid off in terms of your writing. Then so of course we'll go on and talk about aches and pain, what you basically describe, and how they evolve in humans. But before that, let's try to describe what is evolution and evolution by natural selection. So
Yeah,
how we can define it.
yeah. I try to break it down for my students and give them sort of something that they can work with and remember for the rest of their lives. And then we dig into more details in that specific class. So the pieces that I work on for the rest of their lives, it's important to understand that evolution is just change over time. It could be over a short time period. It could be over geologic longer time period. And the more sort of long technical definition is it's gene frequency change in a population over time. So there's important pieces to that. It's important to recognize that an individual does not evolve. An individual lives or dies, reproduces or not, passes their genes on or not, but an individual does not evolve. It's a common misunderstanding. My students kind of come into classes and they think, oh, well, the little bunny rabbit starts to get cold in the winter, so it just thinks, oh, I need to put on more fur, and then it evolves and lives. It doesn't work like that. Like, if it doesn't have enough warmth to survive that winter, that will be the rabbit that dies, and its genes then don't get passed on. So evolution is, I like to try and keep it pretty simple for students and just describe it as change over time. And we can see it happening with animals or with organisms that have short reproductive times, things like bacteria or even insects. You can see evolution happening in real time. You can see insects that have had pesticides applied in some field or something like that. You can see them changing from 1 year to the next and evolving and changing over time. So it doesn't have to be something that is generating new species and thinking in geologic time. Of course, it also does that, but you can see it happening in real time. The natural selection piece, the way I describe it, is that natural selection is one mechanism that can lead to evolution. And it's the mechanism, I give it sort of the 2-word definition of differential reproduction. It is when some animals reproduce more than others. People get so caught up on survival of the fittest and survival. And of course, yeah, if you don't survive, it's going to be unlikely that you reproduce. But the important thing for natural selection is which animals are reproducing and passing their genes on to the next generation. And if they do that, then those traits that they possess will be represented in the next generation to a greater degree. and that's gene frequency change, that's natural selection causing evolution. But it's also important to recognize that there are other mechanisms that can cause evolution. You can have evolution independent of natural selection. So it's one of these things, like anytime you have natural selection, you will also have evolution. But you can have evolution with things other than natural selection. Mechanisms like genetic drift, which is more just sort of the probability of how genes get passed to the next generation. Like I'm only going to pass on, I only passed on half of my DNA to my daughter. And which half got passed on was more of a coin flip kind of situation rather than a selective situation. So that's where, especially in small populations, genetic drift can have a big influence. Animals moving in and out of populations, migration can affect evolution. And then of course, mutation. Mutation is the one that is so interesting because it's the only way that you can introduce new alleles into new genes into a population, is when the gene that's in there changes, and that's mutation. And so that's another very, very dramatic and important mechanism by which evolution can occur.
Right. I think that it's probably easy to imagine, bacteria evolving or insects evolving for most of the people. The problem is when it comes to themselves, humans evolving or humans evolved. So
Right.
so let's also talk about human evolution, that how it happened, and basically these common misconceptions that generally students have, that whether we evolved from a chimpanzee or something, right?
I think the first thing to try and do there, which is really hard for anybody, even biologists and geologists, is wrapping your head around the time scale. Trying to imagine, because to really talk about human evolution, if you can go back 500 million years if you want to, but if you just want to get sort of into the more recent things where the body form is starting to look somewhat like it looks like now, if you don't want to go all the way back to fish and amphibians and reptiles, if you just want to deal with sort of humans and their more recent ancestors, just to have that discussion, you have to try and wrap your head around 5 million years. And that's not an easy thing to do. I mean, I always equate it to money, to people that don't have, like, I don't have $5 million. I don't have anywhere close to $1 million. I don't have anywhere near anything, I could think of money in terms of like a few $100s or a few $1,000s, but to think of like what it actually means to have $5 million, it's a hard thing to wrap your head around. And you have to try and do that with time, because that's the evolutionary time scale for humans and their more recent common ancestors. And if you go back to sort of that point in time, 5-6 million years ago, that's when the lineage of humans sort of branches off from the other great apes. And it's really important to recognize, and I always stress this to my students, that we are not descended from any other living creature that is on Earth. We have some other living creatures, chimpanzees, bonobos, orangutans, that are our closest living relatives. But just like you have a cousin, or you have a sister, or you didn't descend from them, they're just your relatives. It's like that. So chimpanzees, we broke off from that lineage 5, 6, some people say, maybe even a little farther back now. And then since then, the two lines have been evolving independently. And in our lineage, some incredibly important things have happened that have sort of pushed us down this path that makes us uniquely human. The first one is leaving a life in the trees behind and transitioning to the ground. And that there's pretty clear evidence that happened kind of around that 4 or 5 million year ago time, likely driven by a necessity. Not like, hey, animals don't just, if they sort of have this happy-go-lucky life with enough food and they can survive, they're not just going to force a change like that upon themselves just on a whim. It's going to happen because they have to, and likely driven by climate change in diet, the food availability changed, and a life in the trees was no longer tenable for human ancestors. And so that's one of the first big enormous transitions. So that is not the kind of thing that happens overnight. There had to be a period of struggle in there and a period of transition. I talk about it a lot in the book, like exactly how it happened is really fascinating to me, because you think about how the mechanical difficulties of that switch are enormous. So that's the first big shift. And then after, a couple million years of humans getting used to that, again, a couple million years, that's a long time. The brain, the size of the cranial capacities starts to explode and it triples in size. You go from a brain that's maybe 400 or 500 cc's to one that's more, pushing 1500 cc's. And that changes everything in terms of how we're able to use our bodies and the skills that we're able to develop. And that's, so that's when you sort of start pushing on into our genus, Homo, a couple million years ago. Still not even up to modern times with modern humans. That's not more until like 200,000-300,000 years ago. So yeah, that's one of I spend a lot of time with my students. We work on scale a lot in class, big picture ideas about sort of how big is a molecule versus an organelle versus a cell and we work a lot on time and just trying to understand where, when things happen relative to one another and those time scales and how it's all so recent in the big picture. Because we talked about $5 million. Really, if you want to talk about the history of Earth, you have to start talking in terms of billions of years ago. The first bacteria are more like 1 billion or 2 billion years ago. That's a number I don't know if I'll ever be able to wrap my head around that number in terms of what it means and how long life has been around on Earth.
Right. Well, for sure, in this case, humans are very weird animals, that they are doing art and science and talking on Zoom and doing podcasts and,
Yeah, I like to think about sort of like what are the qualities of a human that are the most uniquely human, and those things that have come up and the things you mentioned are in there, things like art and music and religion and controlling fire and speech and literature and all these wonderful aspects of being human that make us so different than anything else that's ever walked the earth. It's also a lot of it also gets us into trouble having such a ability to control our environment.
Right. Okay, so let's go to our catalog about aches and pains.
Sure.
Which one is the sort of enormous pain for you if you think in human life? Which one is like the one which you'll put at the top of your list?
I think for me, it's got to be childbirth. It's something that, and we all have to come into the world that way. And I've seen a few other animals give birth, and it's incredible how much of a struggle it is for humans relative to other animals. So I think I could make you a top 5 or top 10 list, but for me, the number one, and also, as I talked about my daughter's birth in the book, and it was traumatic. And so I have sort of that anecdotal observation that goes on top of everything I've read about other, people's experiences and how long it takes on average for labor and how much blood is lost and things like that. I think that feels like a point it feels to me like we've sort of reached a point in time where the process is finally actually being somewhat checked by natural selection. The brain just does not feel like it can get any bigger and be able to, be birthed. And I feel like we've reached this unique moment in history where those two things are sort of crossing one another, and it makes it really, really difficult for a lot of women.
Right. But then why is it painful in humans? Is it the same in other species, or what are these restrictions?
Yeah, it's really not as it's not to say it's simple for other animals to give birth, but it's not. But the evidence suggests that it's not nearly as traumatic as it is in humans. So it comes back to those giant changes that took place to the hominin line. Bipedalism, there's some really great work. I always tell people that that enjoyed my book to go read. It's also a new book. It came out right around the same time. There's this book called First Steps by Jeremy De Silva. He's a paleoanthropologist at Dartmouth, does incredible work on human evolution. And his group has looked at a lot of the fossils from that sort of transitional time 4 or 5 million years ago and shown that when hominins became upright and started to walk, started to be bipedal, it changed the shape of the skeleton in such a way that the birth canal became a narrower fit. It became the birth became a harder process even before our heads became huge. So if you think back to a fossil, the most famous fossil from that time is Lucy, the Australopithecus fossil. And even in Lucy's time, they have suggested that birth would have been a more difficult process for a human than other great apes. And then we doubled down on it. Then we doubled down on it by taking that already tight birth canal and increasing the size of the head dramatically. I mean, a triple. And so tripling in size, that's the limiting factor, is once that head gets passed in birth, then the rest of it, everything else kind of, the shoulders sometimes cause trouble, but everything else tends to sort of slide out once you get the head passed. And so then, that happened, that increase in size made it even more difficult. And then the modern element, I don't talk about the modern piece of the story that much in the book, but the modern angle to the birth story is that humans have access to, and in many places around the world, humans have access to a level of nutrition that is unparalleled, that they've never experienced before in terms of caloric intake, and in some cases healthy nutrition also. And the fetus does an incredible job of leaching that nutrition from the mother. And what it means is we're growing the biggest babies in the history of humanity. And so you take those three factors, the bipedalism, the giant heads, and then the ability to feed your baby in a way that's never been done before, and it's the perfect storm. And it's why it's one of the explanations, only one of them. There are other explanations, but it's one of the reasons why C-section rates have skyrocketed in the last, in the last period of human history. Now, the other piece of that is people, including doctors, trying to overschedule their lives. So there are more C-sections happening than there should be, but some of them are absolutely flat anatomically necessary.
Right. I mean, yeah, the adult human can be, this smart animals doing arts and science, etc. But when we imagine of the children, human children in general, they are quite helpless, right?
Oh,
Are there any parallels in the other animals?
It's such an interesting part of the human story that we come out so completely helpless. So certainly there are other animals that are, so the terms you use are altricial versus precocial. So a precocial animal that comes out is kind of just comes out raring to go. I like to think of a horse that, they give birth to a horse, the thing kind of shakes it off, licks mom a couple times, and then is like literally running around, which is just hard to even imagine when you come from the altricial end of the stick. There are other altricial animals, things like rat pups or wolf pups or things like that kind of come out with their eyes closed, or they're not really much ready to go. But in terms of how long we stay in that altricial state, months and months and months of effectively helplessness, even you could argue a year or two, humans are pretty unparalleled in that regard. And the best explanations I've read for that, so sort of the old school explanation of why we have to birth the children so early. Why not just leave it in there and let it develop more and put it in there for another few months. Sort of the old school explanation was that it was a mechanical, anatomical, like a woman's hips would not be able to birth the child and also allow her to walk, if it didn't come out when it does. And there's this kind of new explanation for it, which is that, and it turns out, so that was an interesting idea. It's called the obstetric dilemma. but the evidence hasn't really fallen down much in support of that hypothesis. I mean, right? That's how these things work. You have a hypothesis and it's interesting, but then you have to collect the evidence for it to see if it's supported or not. And the evidence hasn't really supported the obstetric hypothesis dilemma very much. And one of the newer ideas is that it might be all driven by energetics and metabolism, and that the child, and especially their brain, are developing so quickly and so fast that metabolically the woman can no longer support the needs of the child internally. It has to then come to the outside where she can nurse it and take care of it that way to support its development. And there is some evidence in that camp. So it's a fascinating subject. It drives so much of our behavior as humans, right? That the child has to come out and then require all of this care. It sets up so many different sort of cultural and dynamics and society dynamics that, yeah, it's a fascinating piece of our biology.
Right. And also the human children can get more time, to learn from parents and
Grandparents. Yeah.
Exactly. And then if we go to the next step, which is generally, getting the teeth in the mouth, that's also interesting. And as you mentioned in the at the beginning of our discussion, that the humans don't have that perfect teeth. So why is that why they don't fit in our jaws?
Yeah, it is really interesting. And I mean, and I'm somebody that mine fit in there pretty darn well until my wisdom teeth came in. And then when my wisdom teeth came in, everything kind of got shoved around, and I just had braces off in the last year. I got braces in my 40s, and because they just kept moving, and my teeth just kept moving around, and I finally got tired of it and fed up and sucked it up and had braces put on. So the interesting part of that story is how much the human diet influences the story. So if you roll the clock back far enough, to sort of that period of time we've talked about a little bit already, where humans are sort of out of the trees. And when I say humans, I mean human ancestors. So when hominins are out of the trees and sort of living in these more open areas, and they're eating foods that are pretty hard to chew. They're eating tubers, they're eating grasses and sedges and these things that require large, powerful teeth in large, powerful jaws. And so if you go back and look at fossils from that period of time, 3-4 million years ago, you have these human ancestors with these large, powerful jaws and large, powerful teeth, because those would have been the individuals that could survive. And those traits were the ones that get passed on, to tie it back to evolution and natural selection. Well, that's all well and good. But then in more recent times, the diet has changed dramatically. We've come up with ways to process our food rather than just having to chew a raw piece of meat, which takes an incredibly powerful jaw. Now we cut that meat up a little bit and we cook it over a fire, or we put it in a pot and cook it until it's just practically mush. You think about some kind of stew or chili or something like that. And that has made it such that we no longer need as big and powerful a jaw as we once did. And when you don't need something anatomically, it makes it prone to having a mutation stick in the genes that control those muscles and tendons and potentially change them. And that's what's happened in recent times, is that mutations have sort of built into that line that have weakened the jaw and made it smaller. And the teeth, effectively, they're independent structures. I spent a lot of the time in the tooth chapter just sort of setting up the idea that the tooth and the jaw are independent structures. Just because one changes does not guarantee that the other one can change. And so the jaw has shrunk considerably over recent evolutionary time, over the last 100, 200,000 years. And the teeth just haven't caught up. We still kind of have bigger teeth than we need for that size jaw. They are shrinking. They're just shrinking at a slower rate. You're getting people now that are born without wisdom teeth, or fewer wisdom teeth, or wisdom teeth that never come in, and other teeth are shrinking. So, if we manage to fix the planet issues and stay alive for another 100,000, 500,000 million years, there's a chance that we'll actually get a decent fit between jaw and teeth, assuming how your teeth fit in your mouth is being used as a point of selection, which is another debatable point. but the teeth just haven't caught up. And as a consequence, we're all stuck wearing braces and having wisdom teeth pulled.
Right. And I think that here we can also talk about parallels, because this is really interesting that especially parallels with the other apes, because we are apes and we got fire, and now we can see that, okay, there is a problem. But then what about chimps and I don't know, gorillas and bonobos, where if, oh, like what happened to their teeth and the jaw?
Right. I mean, they're still sort of working on the historical diet that they've always worked on. So their match and their fit has not really changed over time. If a mutation were to enter into the line of a wild gorilla or a wild orangutan, it would have an incredibly big impact on their life. And if it was one that shrunk the size of their jaw or weakened the size of their jaw, that's an individual that would probably not live. And therefore that mutation, because it's important to recognize most mutations, they either do nothing or they cause something, they cause the protein to work in a way that it doesn't work as well. And every now and again, you get one that slips in there that actually helps and enhances and changes the protein in a positive way for that individual. But most of them have a deleterious, a negative effect. And if you're still needing to use your jaw as a chimpanzee in the historical way, well, that's the kind of thing that would make it difficult to survive. And so then that mutation would die with you. And as a consequence, they're still sort of using their jaws in the same way. So as long as they continue in that way, they'll probably end up with relatively well matched, with a good match between their teeth and their jaws.
Right. Here, actually, we can also talk about the future. So do you think that we'll keep on using braces and everything, or?
Yeah. It's a great question. Like how much, what's one of my favorite sort of theoretical, hypothetical questions that no one really can give a great answer to because it's so theoretical, which is just, to what degree is natural selection? There's zero question that humans are still evolving. It just is a question of how we're evolving and which traits are being impacted. And so, it's an interesting question to ask, to what degree are evolution and natural selection still impacting our anatomy, like the tooth and the jaw? And, in order to impact the anatomy, they have to, in order to impact the evolution of humans, they have to have a role in mate selection and in reproduction. And how much that still goes on is entirely debatable. With all of us fixing our teeth at an early age, most of us are presenting teeth to potential mates that are not our real teeth. So they're making, if they are making selective decisions based on our nice smiles or whatever it is, they're not seeing in most cases the real teeth. And so in that sense, I don't think that selection is having as big a role as it once did on, in terms of the sexual selection angle of it on our tooth and jaw. So I personally think we're probably pretty stuck with our tooth jaw mismatch, barring any dramatic changes to the way we live and go, and some regression to some form where we really have to use our teeth and jaws more. I think we're probably pretty stuck. I think the orthodontists are not going to be out of business anytime soon.
Yeah. Well, we can take this example further as well, that then don't you think it's true for any phenotype that we can sort of consciously fake it? And since there is the mates, they can't really see the reality of it, can be, like that fitness itself. So
yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think some things are more internalized, you're right, but with anything that's sort of more of an external feature, yeah, we've gotten pretty adept at faking those kind of things, for sure.
Right. Okay, so here we can also talk about the since we're talking about faking it and having like sort of guiding that evolution, which I'm not sure whether we can really do it or not, but for sure we can have those brainchilds, these ideas. And one of the idea about existence of this complex phenotypes or structure is the intelligent design. So let's also talk about intelligent design or evolution. So why we are not intelligently designed.
Yeah, I one of the best books that's ever been written on this topic is the Blind Watchmaker by Richard Dawkins, where he sort of just stresses the idea that evolution doesn't have a plan for the future. It just has to work with what it has in that moment, within that individual or within that population, and whatever works best in that moment is what will be selected for. And where that sets you up for trouble sometimes is that what will happen in the future in terms of the environment is in many ways unpredictable. And when the environment undergoes a dramatic change, so, several million years ago when the African climate changed and there was this huge period of drought that changed food availability, all of a sudden the body that you had that was maybe very well set up for the previous environments is not a good match for the current one. And in that sense, the body is not designed very well in that moment. So I think the idea of it, so one of the sort of central tenets of intelligent design is this notion of irreducible complexity, which has just been demonstrated that the idea that a structure is so complex that, an anatomical structure, that if you sort of take away one element of it, it doesn't work. And that logic has just been shown to be patently wrong and false. There are good examples you can give in the body of places where it demonstrates that logic is flawed. One of my favorite examples, when it was being discussed in the States, a few years ago, when school boards were sort of debating whether or not it should be taught alongside evolution, and the ID proponents, one of their favorite examples was a mousetrap. Have you heard this example about a mousetrap?
No.
So the intelligent design community would talk about how, that these features in the body were like a mousetrap, and how if you took a mousetrap has, I think, 5 components to it. It's got the little piece of wood on the bottom, and it's got the little thing you put the cheese on, and it's got the little catch, the lever. And they showed, look, if you take any one of these pieces away, it doesn't work as a mousetrap. So therefore, how this thing had to just be designed, it could not have evolved. And because evolution has to go sort of step by step. You can't just immediately make some complex thing. It has to go step by step. So one of the evolutionary biologists that understood the flaw in intelligent design, he came to the meeting with the mousetrap, and instead of it as a mousetrap, he had removed a couple of pieces of it, and then he was using it as a tie clip. The mousetrap only had 3 parts instead of the 5, so it couldn't catch mice, but it worked as a tie clip. And his point was the function of the structure does not have to stay the exact same over time. It can change over time. And as long as it benefits the organism, even if it has a simpler function, it can be selected for. And that's really important to remember when you're thinking about the complexity of structures and how they evolve. I like the eye as an example of an incredibly complex structure in vertebrates, but you can go back all the way through the vertebrate history, both living and extinct, and find examples of very, very primitive eyes, ones that don't even, the earliest ones don't even form an image. They just sort of give you a yes or no. Is there light or not? Like, yes, light, no light, yes, light, no light. And that's an incredibly simple thing that can evolve and then move step by step, again, over 500 million years into more complex structures. You add a little bit of complexity to it, and it focuses the light in a slightly better way on that very primitive retina. And then maybe that's the cornea, and then the cells that are sort of in the fluid next to it harden up into a structure like the lens, and that allows the light to become refined even more. And you move, and the great thing is that something like that is not just it is a hypothesis, and a theory, but there's tons of evidence for it. If you look through the evolutionary lineage of animals, you can see each of these eyes from simple to slightly more complex to complex in the evolutionary line. And that's where, that I don't teach evolution as a something you believe in or not in my classes. I just teach it as something that is, just like gravity is, and here's the evidence for it. And then you have to just learn to understand the evidence for evolution. And then for me, it's just a question of whether or not you've spent the time to kind of study and understand the evidence for evolution, because it might not be as obvious to the layperson as just dropping an apple on the desk and there's the evidence for gravity. But once you look a little bit, there's evidence everywhere in your life for evolution. So that's kind of how I approached it in the classroom.
Right. And I think one of the also explanation for intelligent design is that why it won't work, because as an engineer or from engineering point of view, if you are creating something or making something, you'll try to make it as best as possible.
Right.
And here since you already mentioned about eyes, here I like one example from Daniel Dennett, that because generally we are very proud of our eyes, that they are the best things, right, and what we can really see. So he gives one example that hold one card like a normal card of, let's say, King of Hearts, and just hold it here like in the like away, and just look straight. You won't be able to see whether, like, what is the color of it. You'll have to and then slowly start moving, and you'll be really amazed to see that how close it should be, to your eyes, to really understand what is it in the on the card. And in my case, I really did this this experiment, and I could see that what he's really trying to say.
Yeah, that's a good example, because I do feel like we need to be kind of knocked down a peg, in terms of our abilities with things like that, especially when you compare us to some other animals that haven't sort of had to work through quite as many transitions as we have, that have incredible vision. We have these giant brains, and that allows us to do all these amazing things that other animals can't do, but we are rather inferior in terms of some of our abilities compared to other animals. I like that example. When we're done, I'm gonna grab a deck of cards and do that. So
yes, this is really good. And I mean, for example, the UV thing that and the night vision. So these are the two things. I mean, of course, most of the time or most of our time we have spent indoors in terms of human history. The lighting and the fire it's still fairly recent, right? So still we really can't, and especially about UV, which is this understanding that the other insects can see UV, which of course we can't.
Yeah, it's so I didn't know anything about it until I was in graduate school, and my graduate advisor, who was just a brilliant naturalist, and he just understood the natural world so well. He was so curious about things like that, about how other animals see and what their vision is like. And he was a brilliant photographer, and he'd taken all these pictures of flowers using these filters that would allow for, and it gets complicated. Like they had to take the UV, so the UV reflectance off of a flower, which is something that we're typically blind to. He took that UV reflectance, and then he would transduce it into a color that we could see, so that we would be able to perceive if the flower was reflecting UV. And so he generated these images of what flowers would look like to animals that could perceive UV reflectance. And they're just wild. I mean, they have all these patterns on them that we are completely blind to and have no idea about. And then other work has demonstrated that insects some insects are quite sensitive, especially ones that might, act as pollinators, things like hymenopterans, bees and wasps and whatnot. They're sensitive to those wavelengths and can see UV patterns in nature that are blind to humans. And the more recent research has shown that other mammals also may be quite sensitive to UV, that humans and other apes maybe filtering it out. Our lenses really act as a UV filter, And exactly why we do that is not perfectly well understood. I'm always stressing to my students, I give them all this information and all these things, and I like them to understand that there's still all these things that are a total mystery to us. And I think that's important because it means there's so much left to do. And I want them to be curious and go off and figure things like that out. And that's one that we don't really have a good sense of. We know that the UV is filtered out by our lenses, but why that happened evolutionarily, I don't think we have a great understanding of.
Right. And also that humans have this trichromic vision, basically, let's say males, because for the females, it can be different, which is why we should also address it. I mean, this also shows that, sort of diversity in science itself, that because
Right.
uh, of course we are doing experiments, as in like males doing experiments and looking at something, but then you see something which is completely different, which is in females, and they have the tetrachromic vision, or some of them, they have tetrachromic vision, right?
So yeah, I mean, I think the more common scenario is that you end up with, so most humans are trichromatic, and the most common deviation from that is males that are only dichromatic, males that are sort of quote colorblind because one of their cones has a mutation in it that makes it so that it's non-functional. Now, it doesn't mean their world is black and white. It just means that they can't see shades of color that people that are trichromatic can. And yeah, this really interesting, more sort of modern take on this is that they've discovered that the daughters of colorblind men have theoretically 4 different cone pigments in their eyes that may allow some of them, not all of them, and some of them, the cone with the mutation doesn't work just like it doesn't in colorblind men. But they have discovered at least one woman who has 4 functional pigments back there, which is different than the way most of the people see the world. It means she's seeing shades of color that none of the rest of us are seeing, shades of color that no other mammals, would see, shades of color that only reptiles and birds and organisms like that are true tetrachromatic animals are able to see. It's just wild to think that the way that we perceive the world can vary so much person to person. It's entirely a different topic, but I love to show this image when we talk about the sensory system in my anatomy and physiology classes. There's this, if you just Google or go into YouTube and look up the right brain, left brain dancer, it brings up this animation of a woman who's just sort of spinning around and dancing. And I show it in class, and we're all looking at the same thing in class. And yet maybe 2/3 of the class perceives the woman as spinning clockwise. We're all looking at the same thing. And the other third of the class perceives the woman as spinning counterclockwise. And some of them, especially I've discovered if they're really young, like I'll do outreach to elementary schools and I'll show this in elementary schools. And some people are able to control with their brain the way they perceive that she spins. They can get her to spin clockwise, and then they can get her to spin counterclockwise and get her to switch. For other people, she'll switch, but uncontrolled. Like their brain will just sort of start to think about something different, and the direction that they see her spinning will switch. I'm completely fixed. She's only ever spun clockwise for me. Every time I do this, she spins clockwise, and I sit there and I think, all right, today I'm going to make you spin counterclockwise, and I never can get it done. And it's just so fascinating because you're all looking at the exact same thing, and yet you're seeing it in a different way. It's like those images that sometimes go around the internet of a dress, and people perceive the color different. Or there was that great one a few years ago with remember the one with the 2 sounds? It was Laurel and Yanny. Do you remember this? Like this thing went around where the exact same audio file would be played, and half the population would hear it as one thing and half the population would hear it as something else. And it was another one of these things where how your brain perceives something can just be so different from one person to the next. It's wild.
Right. And I think this is also one of the example that how much the job is done by our brain, basically, that
Yeah,
the
you're absolutely right. And boy, talk about something that I think it's hilarious that, if I'm old enough to remember that the 90s were going to be the decade of the brain and we were going to have it all figured out by then. And, here we are 20 years on, and so much of that is just still such a mystery in terms of how it works.
right. Yeah. Okay, so since we were talking about the eyes, let's because one mystery for me is the tears. Why
Yeah.
do men cry less, or why women cry more, or it's just the
Yeah, and so I could talk about crying generally. So the crying, the great thing about crying is that we have these eyes that evolved in the ocean, and they evolved as a wet eye in the ocean. The vertebrate eye evolves in the ocean, and it's in the ocean for 100 million years before anything up and crawls out of the water. And because it evolved kind of as a wet eye, we're stuck having to keep it wet. And that is effectively the evolution of tears, is that tears are there to keep your eye moist. You produce an incredible amount of them, and all that anatomy is in place to keep the eye moist. Now, exactly why, anatomically, I can explain it, because the sort of the little collection area for tears in women, at the very sort of nasal corner of the eye, that little collection area is smaller than it is in men. So men, and then it eventually sort of overflows that, and then either has to, go down back into your throat, or if it overflows that little collection area, then the tears end up getting shed. And why that happens more commonly in women than men is a fantastically debatable point. You can make arguments about some social cues and maybe the desire to reach out and get help from close others as you're sort of working through stages of life. That's the first thing that comes to mind for me, is that I think historically, evolutionarily, maybe women were often in more of a social community and gathering than men. And maybe it was some type of cue for other women that, hey, this person needs some help with whatever challenges they're taking on right now. But the anatomical explanation is the easy one. The evolutionary explanation, as is often the case, is much more complicated and difficult to get at.
right. Okay, and since we are talking about sort of abilities, or that the properties of humans, one more property is the speaking, that humans can speak.
Right.
But are we the only species on Earth that can speak?
Yeah, I just was thinking something, just to go quickly back to the tears. Just for the record, I cry about 10 times as often as my wife does. So I think as you get it's one of these things where there's sort of this general trend, but if you look at it on the individual level, it's been fascinating for me how much more often I cry at like movies and TV shows as I get older and older, as the testosterone levels, drop as you get older as a male. I find I'll cry at the silliest, dumbest movies or TV shows these days. And I never would have done that. And never would have happened in my 20s or early 30s. But as I get a little bit older, it's one of these things that I'm convinced is hormonally driven. And it's as the hormone levels change, you're just so much more prone to tears, which is also really interesting. So speech is definitely would make the top 10. I think our ability with language, I think, is uniquely human. There's not really any other animal that has quite the language ability that we do. You could maybe make some arguments for whales and dolphins. Their communication systems are incredibly complex, but humans really have taken it to another level, because we have this ability to speak and communicate, and then you add to that having a brain that allows you to form all these different thoughts, and it just creates a level of language that I think is unparalleled. And the whole trick to the thing is the position of in terms of just ability to form words, is just the position of our larynx. Our larynx, the voice box, is just so much lower down in the throat of a human than it is in all other mammals, that it allows you to, there's this thing called the vocal tract that has a vertical portion to it and a horizontal portion to it. And in order to be able to form words, those two things have to be in a 1-to-1 ratio. And in most other animals, they have very little vertical vocal tract. It's just this sort of short little stubby thing because their larynx is so high up in their throat. They have plenty of horizontal space. They have a snout. They have this, lots of horizontal space, but the vertical portion might just be like my little thumb there attached to it. So they can make noise. They can certainly make sounds, but they can't form them into words. And the human one is so much lower than other mammals that it allows us to not only make noise, but it gives you the muscles in the throat and the tongue space and time to form them into something. You take that and you combine it with an incredibly intelligent animal like humans are, and that gives you the recipe for speech. And then in the book, I talk a lot about sort of that's the pro, like that's the good side of the coin. And then the con is that we lose that laryngeal hookup with our palate, which in other animals makes for a very clear path for the digestive tract versus the respiratory tract, so that they don't really have to intersect and overlap. And the humans, that larynx lowers, and all of a sudden now those two pathways have to do this. And when they do that, that's where you have the potential for choking. So humans are very, very prone to choking compared to other animals. And in many cases, especially as individuals in the early stage of life and in the late stage of life, in a way that can potentially even prove fatal.
Right. And then what is the case in the other hominins? Are there any evidence or to look at the anatomy and see
Right.
how did they have?
It's a great question. And in sort of the older sets, Australopithecus, Homo erectus, and organisms like that, all the evidence suggests that it's that the vocal anatomy is still much higher in the throat and doesn't really allow for speech. It's a difficult thing to study because most of that anatomy is soft tissue, so it doesn't fossilize like the bones do. So you have to sort of look for clues in the head and neck, in the vertebrae and in the shape of the skull. But everything I've sort of read about it suggests that that those really much earlier groups, they don't think had much of an ability to communicate in the sort of modern way that we do. The one group that seems to be debated a lot these days is the vocal ability of Neanderthals. Most people don't realize that Neanderthals were still around only 40,000 years ago, which is really just kind of a blip of time if you're looking at the whole time scale. So very much overlapping the time when modern humans were around, and we know now that their paths crossed, they even interbred. And to what degree Neanderthals were able to communicate vocally is a hotly debated topic that it has not been settled.
Right. And here I think we can also talk about these because you go to YouTube and you can watch many videos about parrots speaking and mimicking humans. So why are they able to speak? Do they have the same anatomy?
And you're talking about infants?
No, the parrots.
Oh,
Like
parrots. I thought you said parents. Parrots. Yeah. No, so parrots are fascinating, right? Parrots, and they do have similar anatomy. They have the whole trick with a parrot is that their vocal anatomy, it's called a syrinx rather than a larynx for some reason. Their syrinx sits way down deep in their throat. So they do have this setup between their horizontal and vertical tract that gives them sort of that close to that 1-to-1 that allows them to form words. And then the other piece of it is having a really flexible and strong tongue is necessary to form words, and they have that as well. And then really the factor becomes, all right, do you have the brain that allows you to do that? And while a lot of birds sort of may have a lower syrinx, they don't also combine in some cases the brain with it, but a parrot brings it all together. They certainly don't have the brains that humans do, which is why many of them can't do much beyond mimic, but there are some parrots that there was one named Alex. I remember years ago, it was an African gray parrot that they taught that bird an incredible number of words. And also, they got it to the point where it wasn't just mimicking. They would lay out different, structures, things that it was used to. I remember there was one experiment where they sort of just set out different colors and keys and pens and pencils, and that parrot got to the point where it could look at something on the ground that it hadn't seen before, and it would say, like, orange, what's that? Using its brain and its vocal anatomy in ways that people never thought a parrot could do. Really neat experiments.
Right. But then here, of course, humans have the most complicated language, and, but we don't have that. Or what about the communication in general? Because for sure, other species can communicate. And in terms of communication, are there other examples that they have sort of more diverse and more complex communication than humans?
I don't know about more diverse and complex, because I don't even like to say apples and oranges. It's like comparing apples and gazelles or something. Like they're so wildly different the way that they communicate. But and I don't know a ton about it, but the communication system of whales and dolphins has degrees of complexity that seem like they kind of rival the way that we do it. The number of types of sounds they're able to make, and the way that they can sort of tweak them to make these subtle differences, it suggests that they are communicating at a level that maybe not on par with what humans do, but that you could at least argue is in the same ballpark. To me, that's the only one that I've read about that even comes close. Certainly birds, there are birds that have complex communication, but nothing like that seen in the cetaceans, whales and dolphins, and in humans.
Yes. But then what about the, so the other quality that we have is the bipedalism. And
Yeah.
the point there is that, are we the only biped on Earth, or there are more examples?
Right. So I teach my students these traits of homologous and analogous characters and convergent evolution, where you end up with a similar trait. So in the example of convergent evolution, you end up with a similar trait that evolved independently in different lineages. And so there are some examples of convergent bipedalism with other organisms that evolved independently from humans that sort of ended up down that same path. The best example are birds. Birds, of course, gave up their quadrupedalism. They evolved out of reptiles. They effectively are just flying reptiles, just like mammals evolved out of sort of a proto-reptilian lineage. And rather than taking their forelimbs in the direction that we did, which is to have our hands free, that allows us to manipulate objects and do all these different things with our hands, they took their forelimbs in a wildly different direction and went down a path that led to flight. So there's a bipedal group that doesn't even use their forelimbs anywhere near the way we do. And a big difference is that they've been at it for 100 million years or more. They've been using their forelimbs that way and have been bipedal for that long. And so I think they probably suffer from many fewer aches and pains as a result, because they've had a long time to kind of work out the kinks of their bipedalism. If you want to talk about mammals, there are some other sort of lines very distinct from humans, like, a kangaroo or something that is technically a biped, but it again, that bipedalism evolved very independent from ours, a lot earlier than ours. And it's such a different way of getting around, right? They get around by hopping rather than walking, that I think we really have to, ours is the only one that we can look at that is sort of in the way that we do it. We're the only ones that get around that way. Yeah.
Right. And, that sort of one change, how much work done, how much work we can do with two free hands in general.
Yeah.
The other interesting thing is the the result of bipedalism, that the fact that we have back pain or knee pain, or in general so many injuries during sports, or
Right.
even day-to-day activities. What about that?
Yeah, you think about the pressures on a skeleton and the changes going from a quadrupedal existence like this, where the spine is like this, to a bipedal existence where the spine has to be upright. That it has forced incredible anatomical change on the human body. The one that I think you just can't get away from is the back. The back had to develop, so the back developed these curves in it to help support a bipedal life. There's a lower curvature that sort of helps shift the center of gravity and place it over the hips. I mean, a lot of it is just things that happened over the course of evolutionary time just to literally keep humans from toppling over. I mean, the other great apes, the spine is C-shaped. It's kind of shaped like this. And if you take a spine like that, you have an animal that when it pops up on 2 feet, it's just going to have a tendency to tip over. And that's what happens to the great apes. They can stand on 2 feet, but their tendency, everything's leaning them forward. And so it takes a ton of muscular work and strain to stay up on 2 feet. They can do it for short amounts of time, but they can't do it for long amounts of time because of that C-shaped spine. Babies are the same way. When human babies are born, they have that C-shaped spine, and they don't even have the muscles to pop up on 2 feet and stay there for any amount of time. And once they get 8, 10, 12 months old, they get the muscles that allow them to do it, and the spine starts to change shape into that human shape. It gets that lower curvature, which shifts the center of gravity over their hips. It gets that upper curvature, which puts the head back instead of forward like it is in great apes when they stand up. And those curves, man, those curves are delicate. Like if they at all start to get out of shape, if the muscles kind of hold it all in place, and if those core muscles start to weaken at all, and those curves start to, if you start to lose that curvature a little bit, or if it gets a little bit off, then because you have a whole little, you've got a column of spinal tissue, the nerve cord just runs right through the middle of it all, and anything that starts to sort of shift out of place pushes on those nerves, and then you've got back pain. And that thing is, of all the issues in the book that seem unavoidable, that's the one that I feel like if you live long enough, especially, that's going to get you at some point. And it seems to get everybody at some point. Some people avoid knee pain, some people avoid foot pain, some people have perfect teeth. But you live long enough, and you're going to someday wake up with kind of a sore lower back. If you're lucky, it doesn't happen until you're 60, 70, 80, but for a lot of people, they're unlucky, and back pain kicks in life in their 20s, 30s, 40s.
Yeah. One thing that we can, or I can think of in general about the life of modern humans is of course, we wear clothes and everything that we were not doing in the past.
Of course.
But the other thing is those comfortable shoes, this, and how many
Yeah.
shoes are there right now?
Oh,
And so are they really helpful in evolution of humans, or like do they really support our anatomy in general?
that's a great question, just about the helpfulness of shoes in general. I mean, I've mostly read about it in the context of running, and it's such a debatable point with running. I mean, you can make the argument that the supporting of the arch and the padding helps cushion the forces that are transmitted up, but the flip side of that coin is that you're sort of tricking your body with all this cushioning, and that your body will then sort of be unaware when potential problems arise, and that you can take an issue that you absolutely would have quickly noticed had you been barefoot, and you would have stopped running, you would have taken some rest, you would have taken some time off of your feet and helped heal that spot. And when you have this squishy shoe on, it allows you to sort of go down this path by which the injury can get worse, and it can get to the point where then it requires, some serious rehab and treatment. So I think, like anything, the right answer to that is probably a good degree of balance. I do think kids should spend more time barefoot than they do to help the muscles in their foot develop and help I've been just reading some papers this week. I'm starting to write some questions for the book for people, if they use the book in classes, that they can sort of have some more in-depth exploration, like the kind of things that we're doing, but sort of in a formal way. I'm hoping it can get printed in the paperback version. And I was just reading a paper last week about, they took kids from two schools. One was in South Africa and one was in Germany. And the one in South Africa, the kids had grown up barefoot, and the German kids had worn shoes their whole lives. And they took these 7, 8, 9-year-olds and they put them through all these different interesting physical tests to see, okay, well, who's at this young age, which students can jump the farthest, which students can run the fastest, which students can. It was really interesting. The kids that grew up in shoes were better at some skills, but the kids that grew up barefoot were better at other skills. Like I remember the skills that involved balance, they put them on balance beams and tested their balance. And the kids that grew up barefoot had a much better sense of balance than the kids that had grown up in shoes. So there's a little bit of give and take there. And I think ultimately the answer is probably a good balance between a barefoot life and a shoed life. It's the kind of experiment that is, it's a heavily flawed experiment. And I point that out because you're starting with people that have already, you have such different factors in those two environments and different genetics in those two environments and different types of people. What you need to do is take kids from an early age and randomly divide them. Take kids from the same population and randomly divide them into a shoed and a barefoot population, and then follow them for years and test them and see what physically comes out of it. I'd love to see somebody tackle that. That would be fascinating.
Right. And then probably we'll also have to have those discussions, right? That which science to trust, because for sure these shoes companies, they will bring some scientists and to really show that no.
Right. Yeah, you have to be very careful about who's financing the research.
Exactly. Yeah. So since we are we have covered like a lot of sufferings in human life, but I think one specific suffering, which is for human females, menstruation. Why does that happen? Because that's also a striking, and is it the same in the other apes and mammals?
Right. Such a fascinating topic. It was the one chapter of the book for me that I went into not having really any idea of what the answer was when I started to read about it and read the papers and do the research for it. I had a good idea of what I would write about for the other chapters. I just had to kind of organize all the modern research and put it together. But for the menstruation chapter, I had no idea why females menstruate. I just didn't know. And so the first thing I learned was that most mammals do not. The majority of mammals do not menstruate. They reabsorb all the blood and tissue with each cycle. The exceptions to that are most of the old world monkeys, so the other great apes do, and other old world monkeys, and a few of the new world monkeys do. And then there's a few random animals out there that also do. There's a few examples of bats. There's some elephant shrews, things like that menstruate. But the take-home message there, which is really interesting, is that most mammals do not menstruate. Some people sort of, they'll see an occasional bloody discharge from a dog or something like that, but it's not menstruation. That's a sign that the dog's coming into heat, and it has nothing to do with menstruation. So, and it's such a complicated topic. What I learned about it is that it all kind of drives to this. So how it evolved and why it evolved all drives to this physiological phenomenon called spontaneous decidualization, which is such a mouthful. It means that that term describes the changes that take place to the uterine lining in a woman. And in animals that menstruate, like humans, those changes take place in preparation for pregnancy rather than in response to pregnancy. So in most other mammals, the uterine lining only really changes when the animal gets pregnant. So the animal gets pregnant, the uterus undergoes all these changes to then facilitate or support the pregnancy. But in humans and the other animals that menstruate, it just happens spontaneously. It happens in response to the control of reproductive hormones, and it changes every month, just getting ready for pregnancy. And then if the woman does not become pregnant, those cells that line the uterus have all already physiologically, genetically, they've undergone this dramatic change, and they then just have to be gotten rid of. They cannot go back to the other state. You cannot energetically support them forever in that state, and there's no way to revert them back to the original state. And so as soon as the hormone levels change again, then it all just has to be sloughed and gotten rid of, and that is menstruation. So then it really drives the question, why do that? Like, why do animals do that? And this is all so modern. This is the kind of thing that's only really been explored in the last generation. It was just a complete mystery for the longest time about why menstruation occurs. And once this phenomenon was hit upon, this idea of spontaneous deciddualization, that's pushed us closer to an understanding. And so then why do that? And the two leading hypotheses about what benefit might that serve a woman are that the degree of placentation in an animal that menstruates is much greater than it is in the non-menstruating animals. So that what that means is that the human fetus burrows into the mother to a kind of an unprecedented, remarkable degree. It nestles all the way down in there next to her blood vessels and completely tucked into the mother in such a way that it can manipulate and control her physiology with hormones that the fetus releases, the embryo and fetus release. And so one thought about spontaneous deciddualization is that it might sort of allow the mother to build in a little, give her some time in preparation to build in a little bit of a barrier between her and the fetus, so that the fetus cannot completely suck her dry of all of her nutrients and all of her everything that she needs to survive. There's this sort of give and take between the mother and child in that way. There's a little bit of conflict there. And so it might allow the mother to kind of get ahead of it in that sense. The other idea is that for reasons that we do not really understand, humans are very prone to making abnormal embryos, chromosomally, genetically. When you bring a perfectly healthy sperm and a perfectly healthy egg together, for whatever reason, it tends to quite often make an embryo that is chromosomally a little aberrant, a little bit off of what you would expect from normal. And many of those end up getting naturally aborted through the process, in the early weeks of pregnancy. And it's been shown that process, that natural process of those embryos getting aborted, can only take place in a woman whose uterus is doing this changing of this spontaneous deciddualization. So it's a way of sort of allowing a natural process by which we sort of select for the healthiest possible embryos moving forward. For women who have an impaired deciddualization process, they're more likely to carry an unhealthy pregnancy deeper into the pregnancy, which typically would then lead to a miscarriage farther on down the line. And women that are prone to miscarriage have been shown to have these impaired deciddualization reactions. So that's this kind of second idea, is that it's this way of naturally promoting, a healthy child being born, which is so important because it's this huge investment on the part of the woman through the pregnancy, after the child is born, and you want to, the body's doing everything it can to try and help you out in that way.
Right. And when you say that there is a huge investment, then of course, from the side of men, it's only that little help, little help from a friend, basically.
Yeah, that's right.
The point is that because this is just a thought experiment that if women, or somehow if women would have found a way to sort of also fertilize their eggs,
Yeah.
the history of humans would
Yeah.
be completely different, right?
Yeah. I mean, there'd be no need for the guys. I talk about it in my intro bio class all the time, because there are a fair number of species that have figured this out, that have eggs that can develop without sperm. The phenomenon is called parthenogenesis, and there are some small animals, like things like a little rotifer, which is this common little kind of microscopic invertebrate that lives in fresh water. There are some species of those things in which they have never ever found the male or a male. It's just females, and they lay eggs that develop without sperm, and that's just how they do. And that phenomenon has actually been found in different species of fish and some birds, and there's a couple lizards it's really common in, all the way up to there's a couple species of sharks. And to my knowledge, they've never found a mammal yet that can reproduce parthenogenetically, but once they do, the women will have no reason to keep us around.
Right. Although we shouldn't smile on that, but yes.
Right.
Yeah. The only thing is because the other thing which men that they bring in the reproduction thing is the variation, right? Because even if the females, they can fertilize their own eggs,
Right.
we'll be losing that variation in the
That's
society.
Right. That's right. It's a huge reason that sexual reproduction has become such a dominant form in animals. And when I say there are some species that reproduce parthenogenetically asexually, it is still very much the exception to the rule. And you are absolutely right that the reason for that is that sexual reproduction just creates such a diverse gene pool, and that sets up a population to be able to handle environmental change and environment. If all these important transitions in human populations that we've talked about, where we survived these climate change events, or we survived these dramatic, that doesn't happen if we all have very, very, very similar genetics. It required diversity in the population, and it made it so that some individuals were able to survive and carry on the human lineage. And yeah, the rotifers are going to be in trouble if there's dramatic climate change.
Yes. And if we try to sum all of it in like few sentences, basically, we can see that of course, humans think that they are perfect and they have everything, best in the world. But when we really sort of try to, divide it and see that how many this anatomical, the discrepancy that we have, like, or how many things that we really lack at the anatomical level, we can see that, and then we can really understand that an engineer, if an engineer is trying to design something, they won't have so many flaws in the design or in the system, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think that if you sort of look at the body as a whole, there are flaws all over the place. And what I like to try and remember, though, is all the good that comes, as all of those flaws generally had to be born as sort of the negative effect of something that was also very positive. So a lot of it drives down to our bipedalism and our giant brains. So yes, we're prone to choking, or we have knee trouble, or we have back pain, or birth is really difficult. But we also, because we have these incredible brains, we have music, and we have books that we can read, and we have all these things that make our lives very rich. And even bipedalism is such a unique and great way to get around that, and having your hands free so that you can play the piano, and so that you can make dinner for your children in ways that no other animal can. There are some good that comes out of human evolution, and I like to think that the pros outweigh the cons, but a lot of people had kind of written about the pros, so I thought it'd be kind of interesting to have a book that focused sort of on some of the difficulties that arose in the process.
Right. Or we can also ask the opinions of females.
Yes. and see if they think the pros outweigh the cons,
Yeah,
particularly in that week after having given birth.
exactly. Yeah. So the last question is future of evolution of humans, larger or big brains or silicon brains?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good question what direction we're going. I mean, I feel like I end the book by talking about, I feel like we've kind of gotten too smart for our own good, and there's some truth to that. With we have these brains that have gotten into all this kind of difficulty on Earth with the way that technology has gone, and now the question becomes, will we be also smart enough to be able to get ourselves out of that trouble? And I like to think that we will. I think our capacity to solve problems is kind of unparalleled, and hopefully we can figure it out, but we're going to have to at the same time sort of set some selfish human nature aside and do it together, and that's not something we've often proven the ability to do, so only time will tell.
Right, exactly. Okay, so this was great. So what's more in your plate? What's more coming? Are you writing another book or?
I thank you. And I really enjoyed talking about it. I love writing this book and I love talking about it. The kind of next idea I've had, and I'm working up sort of in that stage where I'm reading and outlining and getting it together, is I'm considering taking kind of a similar approach, the evolutionary origins of allergies and autoimmune disorders. There's such a fascinating history of our immune system and why we are prone to food allergies and environmental allergies, and then it's kind of on the same page are autoimmune disorders, and humans have this unique history with those conditions that I would like to explore. I'm sort of having to see how, if the first book is successful enough, I'll probably be able to pursue that in a similar way as the first one, and if not, then I may have to pursue it through some back channels, but I'm kind of right now in the process of figuring out how to go about it. But that's the idea I have, and I've started to read about sort of the history of peanut allergies and the history of dust mites and pollen, and man, the topics are just as fascinating, if not more, than I found the ones in the first book, and I feel like they almost touch more people's lives. You just can't run into anybody, everybody's got something going on, even if it's just a mild allergy to to pollen or something. Everybody's lives are touched in some way by allergies and autoimmune disorders, so that's what I'm hoping to write about next.
Right, it'll be, I think, quite fascinating, and especially once you start thinking about those host pathogen interactions and stuff.
You're right.
That's amazing. Yeah.
Thank you.
And what more do you recommend to read? And if people want to find more about you,
Sure,
how they can do it?
Yeah, I love to give book recommendations. One of my favorite all-time books that's a nonfiction book that I use in one of my anatomy classes because the students love it, and it's like I like to think evolution gone wrong is it's fun and it's accessible, but it's also grounded in really great science. Is a book called Gut. The title is Gut. The author is Julia. I think she's German. It's Julia, Giulia. Julia Enders is the author, and the book is Gut. And that is such a fantastic tour through how your digestive tract works, and sort of, it has some evolution in there also, but a lot of more just sort of practical, here's how your gut works. And it's funny, and it's really well written, and she's an MD from Germany. It's a fantastic book. So I would tell people to read Gut, read that if they're interested in sort of the human evolution, transitional kind of biology. That book, First Steps, I mentioned, is also another really good one. And if anybody, anybody that wants to reach out, once you've read through those two, just reach out to me via email or via my Twitter, and maybe you can include those links when you put the podcast together. And I'm always happy to tell people more book recommendations and more sort of guide them to other reading that is along these lines. It's really good.
Perfect. Okay. So thank you so much, Alex, for the great discussion and for putting all these big ideas in one book, Evolution Gone Wrong.
Thank you for having me, Jitendra. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.